Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in Phenomenology and the Theological Turn. And we're going to take a look at pages 50 to 70. It's the third part of the introductory essay by Janicaud, and this will conclude the section by Janicaud, the introductory essay. And then after this lesson, we will begin looking at the response essays. And I believe the first one's going to be by Paul Ricoeur. But now we want to take a look at, in this lesson, we're going to take a look at, we've already looked at Husserl and Heidegger and Levinas. Now we're going to look at Jean-Luc Marion and Christian, who followed Levinas. And we'll take a look at Janicaud's interpretation of their offerings and his conclusion, which is negative, by the way. He thinks they have compromised phenomenology, so his conclusion is a negative one. But we want to examine his presentation here and to further define this theological turn. Let's begin with Block 1 and take a look at the rereading of Hegel. We begin with the question of transcendence. Aristotle posited a science of being and a science of highest being. Levinas posited transcendence as the other. We must next look at Jean-Luc Marion as he takes up Levinas in his reduction and givenness and his take on the field of phenomenology. So under Jean-Luc Marion, Heidegger posited a disengagement with the mode of metaphysics. Marion took up Heidegger and posited a theology of Christ-like love, where theology becomes possible within phenomenology. Per Marion, theology is possible within phenomenology. In fact, he posited that phenomenology actually completes metaphysics. That's what Marion did posit. And he said we're entering an era of the post-metaphysical. We are entering the era of the post-metaphysical. So under that heading in Note 3, metaphysics has entered into its process of ending. It doesn't end abruptly, but it's in the process of being closed out as that articulation of the senses of being. The senses of being are now being addressed by phenomenology, and metaphysics is being bracketed. Therefore, there must be a complementary order of phenomenology, because for Marion, phenomenology exists out of and from metaphysics. He takes up a rereading of Hegel. He is inspired by Husserl, but he takes up a rereading of Hegel and seeks to separate phenomenology from system. In other words, forcing Hegel to be strictly phenomenology, to separate out the phenomenology from the system, to separate out the metaphysics in Hegel and take up his phenomenology. That was his intent. Janicaud is going to say that he did not succeed in doing this, but that was his intent. Now, if you look at Note 4, Phenomenology and the Hegelian System, Alexander Kojève also reread Hegel from the anthropological point of view. Remember, he took up and criticized the master-slave parable. Jean Hippolyte reread Hegel from the existential point of view, and Heidegger saw tension between Hegel's phenomenology and Hegel's logic as a change of emphasis from ontology to speculative theology. And even Husserl did not reject a general metaphysic, in other words, a metaphysic of the eidetic, a metaphysics of eidos idea. So Janicaud says it's not impossible to come up with a metaphysic of eidos idea. That's not impossible. However, he is going to criticize Marion for not positing a authentic phenomenology, but he does admit here in this block 1 that the possibility does exist to have a general metaphysic of eidos idea. So if we take a look at note 5, room for a metaphysic of the eidetic, a metaphysical phenomenology is possible. In fact, authentically, it can only be metaphysical. It is Heidegger who actually radicalized this issue by opening the ontological question and the question of the essence of metaphysics. In other words, Heidegger opened the possibility for a new metaphysic. That new metaphysic could exist, not the 19th century German idealism, but a new metaphysic could possibly emerge. Now we'll take a look at block 2 and take a look on how Marion and his schema become concrete, because this is where Janicaud is going to critique and basically draw a negative conclusion concerning Marion. And under schematization, Marion posited continuity between phenomenology method and the pure form of call as givenness. He formulated this as a system of reduction in 3 moments: the moments of the transcendental, the existential, and the purely given, which align themselves with Husserl for the transcendental, Heidegger for the existential, and the purely given for Marion himself. So he becomes very systematic. So for someone trying to separate out system, he actually posits a system. Now, under reduction, transcendental reduction seeks to disengage the eidos phenomenon and constitute it in consciousness. The transcendental horizon exists as the backdrop of all eidos phenomena. This horizon transcends all constituted objects. It is always slightly beyond concept. We are always grasping to articulate the manifestation, but it's always slightly beyond concept. So under the transcendental horizon of consciousness, Marion systematizes Husserl's reduction. Now, existential reduction, the Heidegger position, that addresses the understanding of being. But the overall 3-part reduction forms the rationale of schema for Marion. So he has a systematic reduction. If you take a look at note 4, Marion adopted Heidegger's position of the horizon of intentionality, which abbreviates all 3 reductions, including the ecstatic horizon of time. Including that ecstatic horizon of time. Being is analyzed through the pure form of givenness call. Call is given as originary schema, which overflows out of the saturated phenomena in experience. It is through the saturated phenomena that the Absolute amplifies itself and supplies those tendencies where we can recognize the eidos ideas. So I've got a little bit of a little triad there at the bottom of block 2, and basically you've got a triune systematized presentation by Marion. He says we begin with, when we confront experience, we begin with the development of a transcendental consciousness, and we begin with transcendental reduction, which will seek to grasp the eidos ideas in reality. Then we enter into that transcendental consciousness, which informs and signals self-identity. That becomes the existential reduction, where we question the being of the self and the being of other selves. But all of it is a process that leads to the givenness of saturated phenomena. So we conclude, when we do get to the work of the intellect takes up the position of humility and says, this is given by the grace of God. What I have discovered is given by the grace of God. What I discover in intellect, the sorting of the eidos ideas, the forming of the eidos ideas into a structural sign model, all of that is gift. All of that is gift of spirit. So he really does say that ultimately we have to say that all is givenness. So reduction serves givenness. Now, in Block 3, we're going to take a look at Janicaud's criticism of Marion. He's also going to pick up Cretion, and he's going to criticize both of them for veering away from true phenomenology. In other words, yes, they did posit a theological project, they did posit a theological swerve, but it's worse than a swerve. Janicaud says they are veering away from phenomenology altogether. They are abandoning the neutrality of phenomenology. So let's take a look at Block 3. We begin with Janicaud's criticism of Marion. He says in Marion's work, there is no respect for the phenomenological order. Instead, it is manipulated and reduction is misused, and the phenomenology of the unapparent is used as an alibi for his ambiguity of givenness. This is a theological veering that runs under the supposed cover of a true phenomenology. So absolutely critical of Marion. He then takes a look at Cretion's phenomenology of promise. He says that Cretion posited the voice of the body. He took up the study of the character of manifestation, which is phenomenology. And in rendering itself visible, the body lets come to light the invisible soul of the real in its perpetual origin. So invisibility is made visible. So we take a look at this, the invisible real coming to light. And Janicaud says, how does this notion really escape metaphysics? For Cretion, this manifestation equals a sign toward glory, not a complete manifestation. And eternal life is equated with the act of praise. But Janicaud says, how does that really escape metaphysics? It does not. Again, it is just like Marion, it is metaphysics pretending to be phenomenology, according to Janicaud. But it's all interpreted through the perspective of the promised resurrection. So we take a look at Block 3, Note 5, Rethinking Promised Resurrection. Janicaud says we must question Cretion's bias of the call, a call imposed upon the reader. Cretion posits the sense of incarnation. The naked soul is the naked voice, the rhema voice of spirit that already surrounds us. I happen to agree with that, but we have to examine this from Janicaud's critical point of view here. We're not allowed to draw conclusions here. We're here to examine the evidence in the text. Janicaud says that Cretion is positing rhema voice that is already surrounding us in experience. Janicaud says this betrays phenomenology, and it introduces a metaphysics of the divine secret. It introduces a metaphysics of the divine secret. Well, my hope would be that we could develop a new metaphysic of the rhema voice of Christ, because the New Testament certainly affirms that in the Gospel of John, so I would certainly desire that. But in this instance, we have Janicaud's criticism And he says, we now need to take a look at Block 3, Note 6, because metaphysics of divine secret has been posited. He says, Marion and Cretan both weave a theological veering. They have veered off course, away from phenomenology. Revelation cannot be claimed to broaden phenomenology. Phenomenological neutrality has been abandoned by Marion and has been abandoned by Cretan. Husserl posited the bracketing of the transcendence of God because it overstepped the notion of pure consciousness. Religious consciousness cannot posit notions like the call or the promise. So Janicaud closes out his essay by saying that religious consciousness has not been bracketed, and therefore phenomenology has been overstepped. Its neutrality has been compromised. Now let's go to the bottom of the chart. I've got two little timelines there I want us to take a look at. And the first is going to be the timeline for Marion. He begins with a theology within phenomenology, a general metaphysic of the eidetic, of eidos idea. He does posit a systematic three-moment reduction. Remember, transcendental, existential, and the given. He posits the horizon of intentionality within consciousness, and a schema can be formed from the saturated phenomena that are overflowing with givenness. And that is his key notion, the notion of givenness. And then finally, Janicaud says this is a theological veering off course from true phenomenology. Next, let's take a look at Cretan. He posited the voice of the body that reveals the invisible soul of the given real, the invisible within the visible. It is recognized as eidos sign toward glory, and then in grasping this within consciousness, we take up the act of praise. The action of the intellect in the realm of positing is called the act of praise. And self-consciousness exists within eschatological hope. Cretan has posited a new sense of incarnation, and that givenness for him is the rhema voice that surrounds us in reality. Janicaud says this is metaphysics being unbracketed. It's a metaphysics of divine secret. Again, it's veering off the course of true phenomenology. So we get our introductory essay, and from this point on, we're going to start looking at other contributions in response to this essay, but we have now looked at Husserl, Heidegger, Levinas, Marion, and Cretan. And then we have a good feel now for the direction that phenomenology and theology have taken in France, basically mediated through Levinas. And in our next lesson, we're going to take up the first response essay from Paul Ricoeur.